Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Ethex's Cuppa Club. My name's Lisa Ashford, and I am CEO of Ethex and Energize Africa, two positive investment platforms. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about affordable housing, and I've got three brilliant guests with me today. So I've got Helen Bartlett, who is from Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust. I've got, if you want to give us a wave, I've got Mike Lowe, who is chair of Mustard Seed. And we've got Ben Wrigley, who's investment manager at Resonance, who's been working with Mustard Seed in the last two offers that they've been running. So today we're going to be having an introduction to the businesses from each of the participants, and we're going to be running some questions, Q&A afterwards as well. You can submit the questions via the chat function throughout the session, and I will try and direct those to the right people at the right times. I'd just like to say as well that this should not be treated as financial advice in any way. We can't answer any specific questions relating to your own personal financial circumstances. And this isn't a recommendation to invest. It's just purely a showcase of both organisations and what they do. If you'd like to follow up, and we'll send an email after the session as well with some more information if we can. So as we emerge from this global health crisis, some of the residual challenges, huge challenges that as a society we face are becoming more prominent again. And the challenge of affordable homes and trying to reduce homelessness is one of those major challenges. Around the country, there are organisations who have been working tirelessly in the background for many years in some cases to try and provide solutions to this problem. And we're represented today by two of these great organisations. This is about trying to find solutions that are affordable for people in perpetuity. And for us to retain the rich, diverse population in sometimes rural communities, and supporting people who perhaps have more needs and need assisted housing as well. So firstly, I'd like to bring forward Mike, who I mentioned is chair of Mustard Seed. And Mustard Seed are running their second offer on Ethex at the moment. And if you'd like Mike to take the floor and tell us more about your organisation, and then we'll switch to Helen afterwards. We'll go from there. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you very much for that. My name's Mike Lowe. I'm chairman of Mustard Seed Property Limited. And I joined the organisation about 5 to 6 years ago. A little bit of history just about myself. I grew up in a farming family, and actually from 1980 joined the Milk Marketing Board as a farm management consultant, and I've been in business consultancy ever since. Yeah, I worked for the Milk Marketing Board for somewhat over 20 years, and over that time our work, or my work and my experience, widened to rural business consultancy. In year 2000 I decided to set up my own business and went independently and successfully ran my own company, which I've actually sold on 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago now. And so my sort of, if you like, skills have been very much in sort of looking at businesses. Sometimes businesses aren't doing terribly well, quite often not doing terribly well, and analysing them and working a way forward for them, giving them a forward budget and and policy to go forward into the future in a more profitable and better way. And then to see that through, in other words, to go to the bank or other financial institutions to acquire the cash to actually make that work. And I thoroughly enjoyed doing that. I've also had an interest in property all my life. In actual fact, I went to university initially studying architecture, which wasn't really, turned out to not be my cup of tea at the time. And I flunked out of that and actually graduated in agriculture. Quite a change there from one to the other. So I've had a sort of an interest in farming and buildings. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I joined Mustard Seed, and at that point we had one property. We had our property in Helston, and that's a 6-bedroom property, and the aim of the organisation is fundamentally to help vulnerable people and to keep vulnerable people off the streets. So we take people, we're not necessarily offering, and the aim isn't to really offer really long-term accommodation, it's to rehabilitate people into normal working life, if you like, to help them. So there's a support element there to actually help them out of their current problems, whatever they might be, into a job, into somewhere to live. And we do this in our local community. That's the aim, that we're not distant. The aim is to keep, if you like, people that live in Cornwall and give them the opportunity here where they know and quite often have family close to, have been brought up here. So that's the aim of the organisation. And the property in Helston has had about 40 people go through it so far. And we regard that as a success, but we want to do a lot more than we've done before. And we have an aim now to expand from that. We had we raised money through Ethex 2 years ago now, and we've been searching for suitable property for quite some time. Suitable property there's a lot of old commercial property on the market, but often it doesn't turn out to be highly suitable for us. We have now purchased in April a property in Redruth, which has 3 commercial units in it, and it's 3 stories, and it needs refurbing. We managed that purchase mid-April this year, and we've got employed an architect, quantity surveyors, you name it. We've done so much research on this property to make sure that it could be a really viable opportunity. What we've got now, our plans are all done. They're just about to go in for planning permission. The property did have planning for conversion before, so we're pretty hopeful and that it shouldn't be that much of a complication. We've got a slightly different layout to how it was before, but fundamentally, the council did approve conversion of the building into flats. This building now, our vision for it is, it's going to have one fairly substantial retail space in it still on the ground floor, and it's going to have 6 apartments, small apartments within it. So it basically more than doubles what we can offer, to people for help. We're all ready to run on that. We are short of about 150,000 to complete this project at the moment. So that's partly why we're doing this fundraise at the moment, so that we can actually complete this project to a good standard as well. We don't want it to be, if you like, cheap. We have partners that we work with. The house in Boston is currently let out to St. Petrox, who have a very high occupancy rate of that property. And as I say, the aim is for people to pass through that, to help people in their point of need, keep them off the streets, and actually rehabilitate them into work and as much normal life as we possibly can. We also have a partner, Carrot Community, who provide help for people in similar sort of positions. So we've got partners all set up that we work with already. We do have longer term aims as well. We can see this property in Redroof being a success. It's very much in a central location. It's close to the train station and very close to the town centre. So it's absolutely beautifully situated in so many ways. So we're really quite excited about that. Because what we don't want is a property that's out in the sticks really for people that need help and need to be able to get to employment. So it's ideally placed, absolutely ideally placed. Our sort of longer term vision is to go on further and develop further properties. We certainly have very much an eye on St Austell in Cornwall, which is an area where there is quite a need, and there is a huge need going forward in all these Cornish towns. There's no doubt about that at all. We have no doubt about being able to fill these properties actually many times over. So that's where we are at the moment, just about to put in the planning, with the idea that if we get planning within in 2 months, say, which we would hope, we can start developing the property in the autumn, and it should be ready for letting in 2021. So in the meanwhile, our cash flow is somewhat stretched, if you like, because obviously we haven't got any income from this property at the moment. But the business plan looks good, and I don't see why at all we can't continue to offer a good rate of interest on shares. We've currently averaged over 3%, 3.5%, and the target on now is 3.5% from 1st of October and 4.5% from October 21. So that's our sort of aims there. I'll finish there and take questions. Okay, over to you, Lisa.
That's lovely. Thank you, Mike. That gives us a really good overview. And obviously, you're right. Your business model is different, I think. We'll find out to Helen's. So, and I think we can talk about that a little bit more, and what is the gap that you're filling, and why is it that we feel that community solutions are able to fill that gap. But first, let's hear from Helen from Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust. Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, really interesting to hear about the work you're doing. Sounds incredibly important. So as Lisa said, I'm Helen. I work for Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust. I've been working there, donating our share offer rate October last year, but my background, I have found in community-led housing, specifically housing co-ops across the city. So I've been involved in developing community solutions for probably about 15-20 years now. Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust is a young organisation ourselves. So the history, we started in 2014, and the need for us emerged out of a series of meetings with housing activists and people working in housing across the city. And we were constituted as a community land trust, so aiming to work as a community land trust for the whole city of Brighton and Hove Community Benefit Society. So we have a membership of over 400 people currently, of people who live in Brighton and Hove, you can see that the housing situation is not working for the majority of people who live in our city and who kind of want to contribute to finding alternative community-led solutions to that. So for those who are or aren't familiar with Brighton and Hove, I mean, housing, I don't like to use the term crisis because I think where housing is comes out of a system of political choices that have prioritised profit over people and communities. But I think it feels like a crisis to a lot of people who are experiencing the consequences of kind of poor, unaffordable housing. So the situation in Brighton and Hove, you know, we have the second highest house prices in the country, and it's nowhere near reflected in the average incomes. We have the second highest rough sleeping population. Average rents take up approximately 68% of average incomes, and you know, you see it when you're out and about. Families are having to move away from areas that they live in. Young people are having to move away from areas that they kind of grow up in. We recently, Lisa, you touched on this, as part of our work during coronavirus and lockdown, we carried out a survey to kind of find out people's actual experiences, lived experiences of housing during lockdown. And there were some really kind of interesting and upsetting statistics kind of coming out of that. So for example, 36% of people not having their own outside space, nearly a half of people living in housing that is too small or unsafe, 40% of renters worrying about paying their rent each month. And these kind of lived stories of how that is impacting kind of people in these times. So we're very fired up at the Community Land Trust about trying to create housing not just that's affordable, but actually that really like looks at what people need, looks at different groups of people and what they need, and finding housing so that isn't just affordable, but that's long-term secure, you know, that reflects people's diversity, that reflects people's creativity, that builds communities that can support each other. So that's our kind of overall goal. And the way we do that is we work as a community land trust, and we work with community-led housing groups across the city. So community-led housing groups are groups of people who come together, identify a shared housing need, which might be, you know, having more support as people grow older. It might be finding housing for groups who typically struggle to find it. It might be building buildings that are more sustainable, that are better for the planet. And we support those groups. We support those groups to create their own housing. And our role as the Community Land Trust is either to enable those groups, or within the context of the share offer at the moment, our goal as the Community Land Trust is to buy land or property that we then lease to those community-led housing groups who kind of live in it, run in it, live in it and run it themselves. So our share offer is aiming to do that, to raise the funding required to buy that land and property and to lease it to those groups going forward. And as a community land trust, as a community benefit society, one of the reasons we set up in that structure was because we have a statutory asset lock, which means that once the property is owned by us, it's in the hands of the community for per child on. It can't be used to kind of make a profit from it. So one of the reasons we keep the housing affordable is because we pretty much like wipe out that profit line that goes to people. You know, We get mortgages on properties. We have our share offer issue where we have a commitment to pay back an interest rate to investors. But we ourselves, as a community benefit society, are not trying to make profit. We're just trying to create that affordable, secure housing, and then any surplus we generate in later years goes back to support more projects across the city. So just to give a couple of ideas, because I think it shows our kind of diversity in the range of projects that we work with, some of the groups that we're working with, groups and projects we're working on at the moment. So one of the projects that's one of the first focuses for our share offer is we're working with a group called Sea Salt, who are the first student housing cooperative in the southeast. We're kind of encouraging our next generation of cooperators and community organisers, and the aim there is to buy a large house that we will lease to Sea Salt. As a group, I think it's often thought that a lot of housing is provided for students. Actually, often what happens is a lot of expensive and less high quality housing is provided for students, and kind of students that have more barriers to accessing education in terms of money or resources are left out from that. So our aim is really to work with students that might kind of be struggling with that, but also that aren't taken advantage of, which happens at times by private landlords. So we're working with Sea Salt, who are a great student housing co-op of kind of 10 young people, very active, very motivated to develop their own co-op. We work with a group called Bunker, who are building beautiful, sustainable eco homes for low-income households. They've just completed work and moved into their first 2 properties, and they are doing that on kind of sites that are leased from the council. We're working with a group called Sea City, who are an LGBTQ group, who are trying to buy a shared house that will be aimed for key workers. And we're working on a big project at the moment that's on an urban fringe site in the city, that is working with a group called Colding Community Organisation, which is an area originally a council estate, kind of affected by decades of right to buy and also family houses being sold off, so people are having to move out of the area, and we're looking at developing a kind of quite a big project of sort of 40 houses, but that really works on an urban fringe area and not just provides, doesn't just provide kind of, as I say, affordable housing, but works with kind of the landscape and the ecology and different ways people can live and work together. So we have a really super wide range of groups, and the reason for that is that kind of we work from the needs of the community. So we work from that kind of aspect of groups coming together, saying, here's something that's affecting this group, and how can we find our own solutions, because we think as well for housing there needs to be so many solutions, doesn't there? There needs to be more council housing, absolutely, but there also needs to be, community-led housing can provide that alternative option, where people are kind of mobilising themselves and are leveraging resources and funding in order to take projects forward. So I think our long-term, we've got some immediate aims. Our first aim is really to buy our first property. We don't own a property yet, so it's to buy our first property. But long-term, I think we would like to see community-led housing more established as, a mainstream way that says housing can be better than it is at the moment, and can be better for so many more people than it is at the moment. And I think that's what we're working towards.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. So those are 2 overviews of slightly different organisations in terms of their purpose, but very much about achieving similar goals, really. And so let's come to some questions. I mean, the obvious question for people who aren't familiar with with these types of organisations to start with is what is the need for community-based organisations to establish and try and come up with solutions? What gap is it that you're filling, and why is there a gap? And is your solution better than one which could be provided by, you know, the council? Or so Helen, why don't you go first, and then over to Mike.
I think we're in that type of situation, and I think some of the recent you know, kind of things are being written about this at the moment, that, you know, things aren't working. Things are quite seriously not working in our country's housing, really, really clearly. And I think what that shows, is that we need this range of solutions. We need this range of different ways to approach. So at BHCLT, we certainly work closely with the council, who have commitments themselves to, you know, building new council houses, building new affordable homes. But even if they are able to meet those commitments, which are high and aim high and are great, there's still going to be there's still going to be many groups who, for example, who, you know, struggling with their houses, are in housing that's unaffordable and unsuitable, but would never make it to the kind of level of need of people on the Brighton and Hove housing register, or would never be eligible for social housing in that. So for me, what I think is that we need to work on these different levels of solutions. But I also think one of the things that I think is exciting that comes out of community-led housing is this ability to say different groups have different, it's not a one-size-fits-all, different groups have different needs and can develop things, you know, and can develop solutions around those needs, and can show different ways of doing things. And because, you know, how we work is with these groups, so we have these groups who like often work for years to kind of develop their projects. They put in so much kind of time, energy, resources, commitment into kind of making these things happen. So I think as an organisation working in grounding in the community, you can draw from the resources of that community, and so that gives you a greater pool of things. And, you know, Brighton, it's interesting, isn't it? We have so many people who need housing and need better housing, but it's also quite, on many levels, it's quite a wealthy city as well. So I guess that's part of the idea of our community share offer. How can we mobilise this city in which we know that people, maybe have more resources themselves, but also recognise that, like, the housing market isn't good. It isn't good for them. It isn't good for their children. And how can we bring that together to develop solutions? So yeah, that's how I think.
Thank you. Mike, over to you. What's your perspective?
There's an absolutely huge need in Cornwall. Cornwall has high levels of deprivation, particularly in the ex-mining areas of Camborne, Redruth and St Austell. And we work alongside other organisations. What I didn't probably make quite clear in my introductory bit was that we source, we acquire and refurbish property to the requirements of our partners. The partners currently St Petrox, Carrick and Holywell Housing Trust. We provide the property and lease out to them so that they don't have to get involved with the responsibility and the financial burden of actually owning the property. We do all that side of it and lease out to them, and it's a business plan that's working, and we can just see such a huge need going forward, as we are told constantly by these organisations. You know, it's just endless need. Even if the council was able to and could afford to build affordable housing, you know, at such a high rate of knots, there's no way that there's going to be enough, and people are falling through the cracks, and of course some of them are ending up on the streets. And our aim is to rescue them, give them somewhere before they get onto the street, before they get into that highly vulnerable situation where drink, drugs, and all the rest of it, you know, is such, you know, such a threat to them. So that's our vision, is to work alongside these other people that who are better than we are at actually providing the care that's needed. We're providing the property and facilitating the care that they can then put in alongside us.
And what about the support, Mike? How are these residents then supported to transition back into a working life?
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. We have space for a bill, you know, for somebody a live-in worker. There's a live-in warden in the house in Helston, and that's absolutely critical. So there's somewhere on the spot who can deal with problems as they arise, and, you know, encourage, facilitate, and give them the care that they need. Because often, obviously, they're sometimes in, you know, quite a vulnerable state when they come into our property. So that is all part of the plan, that there is somebody there on site to assist. Otherwise, I don't think that the plan would work anywhere near as effectively.
Right. And I've just been listening earlier this morning. We're so many Zooms. There's so much interesting information and access to brilliant minds at the moment. Listening to a webinar from partly from LSE, talking about just transition, and first of all, how important local place-based solutions are, and so that seems particularly important in these two cases, both in terms of Brighton, where you say, you know, it's got such a high level of homelessness, and to a certain extent the southwest as well, which is changing in terms of its economy and job creation. And, you know, I'm going to slightly put you on the spot here, both of you, because there is always you know, I think for some of our investors as well, they see sustainability really relating to renewable energy, and affordable housing doesn't seem to necessarily come into their minds when they're thinking about sustainability. So is that something which is thought about in terms of the properties that you acquire and how you refurbish those properties? So can we bring people who are very set on thinking about clean tech and renewable energy and into this, you know, world of affordable housing as well? In terms of overall sustainability, is that possible? Mike, what's your view?
Certainly, in the case of our first house and the second property, we have renewables installed, you know, solar panels on the house in Helston, and we certainly are looking at you know, the most sustainable solution for the property in Redruth as well. Yeah, because I believe that's important.
How about you, Helen? How is that incorporated into the design and the thinking?
So I think it's really, I think for all of our groups, that kind of level of sustainability, both in terms of efficiency and also how we can live more sustainably in terms of kind of sharing resources is fundamental. You know, it's always when we are planning our, you know, when we're doing our financial viability, it's always one of the kind of key things that's going in, that goes into that. Bunker, who I mentioned earlier, who've just built their first 2 homes, and still is to roll out. So it's basically using cross-laminated timber, not quite as fast, but to amazingly like high sustainable, energy efficient standards. And the way they're planning on is just using that as a model of housing that they transfer. So instead of building different housing for different sites, they build these kind of very eco homes, the same on the different sites. So yeah, it's very much, it's more tricky sometimes when it comes to kind of, when I talked about, you know, buying a property, it's more tricky when it comes to like buying an existing property and the kind of level of works that we can do. Some of the houses that you have in Brighton, certainly some of the ones we're looking at kind of on the seafront, big old houses, constructed with bungaroos, which is specific to Brighton and things, you know, it's harder, but it's always, you know, we work with one of the energy services co-ops here to look at what the kind of level of renovations we can do. We're really aware that, you know, our planet needs looking, you know, our planet looking after with the climate emergency, our planet needs looking after as well as our people. And so we're very much involved in those conversations on a kind of ongoing basis. So for us, that kind of level, it's not just about being affordable homes, it's about being homes that really, like, as I say, work for people and work for kind of our world around us.
Yeah. One of the other points about this just transition was how we need to blend finance and look at finance from banks blended in with other mechanisms. And, you know, in this case, we're looking at investment crowdfunding. So Ben, I just want to pull you in a little bit here. 2 questions. One that's come from the audience. Someone asked about whether the investment product was a bond or not. So I just wanted to just ask you, first of all, why choose withdrawable shares over loans or bonds, but also how that all fits into the financing mix in general. So, you know, is there a mortgage as well? How is the bank sitting alongside this raise? So if you could just sort of describe a little bit from your perspective on what you're seeing with Mustard Seed and how that fits together. And then I'm going to come on a little bit to the risks afterwards. So we'll do that as step 1. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. So the idea at Mustard Seed Property has always been to have a sensible blend of equity in terms of community shares and debt. So there is a mortgage on the first house with Triodos. So the idea is, you know, to raise investment mostly from the community, but also from socially minded lenders. That mortgage now is about £100,000 with a house valued at say £300,000. So, you know, at a really sensible level, but means they could borrow a little more there if they wanted to. For the second property, we've agreed some more debt with a lender called Open Box Developments. Again, a socially minded lender who wants to put his money to work supporting projects like this. It's on pretty favourable rates, and that will help us get the refurbishment done on the second property. And then the view is just to continue actually to raise debt at a sensible and affordable level, so Mustard Seed Property can continue to pay a return to community shareholders as well, which they've now done for over a decade. So, you know, as Mike spoke about, you know, the ambition now is to take this model, which works, and to scale it up and to roll it out and to do it elsewhere, given the need across Cornwall. You know, the first project, just in case people aren't aware of the charities, St Petrox is very much a homelessness charity. The second property where Mustard Seed are going to be working with Carrot Community, CIC, and Hollywell. They provide respectively support to people who are learning disabled and housing support and tenancy support and support into employment for that cohort of people. And the third property could well be working with people who are in recovery from addiction. So it's all sorts of issues, and which are faced everywhere. But as Mike said, there's real issues in Cornwall, outside those attractive coastal areas. That is all that some people see. So yeah, sorry, to answer your question, Lisa, the plan is to just maintain sensible levels of debt. And just to finish the point, I think once Mustard Seed Property do have the second property refurbished and fully let to that second charity partner, they might well consider doing a bond. If that can offer community investors, whether locally or nationally, and we've got people invested from all across the country, an opportunity also to benefit from some tax relief, and where we'd hope that perhaps they'd come in with community share investment, but it could also have some money in a bond. I think it'd be lovely if eventually, when there are 3, 5, then even more houses, that most of the money came, or all the money came from community investors who could have some in equity in their withdrawable community shares, and some sitting there in a bond with the comfort that is secured, against property on sensible leases, supported by really strong charity partners.
Thank you. And Helen, how do banks work with you to provide the financing solution?
So I think there was a question about whether conventional lenders as well will work with CLTs. So we work with specific social lenders who we build up relationships with. So they're very much kind of involved in projects, in discussions about projects from kind of quite early stages. So we've worked with Ecology Building Society, Triodos, and the Charity Bank. Yeah, and the Charity Bank as well. Sorry, mind slipped there. So we work with those. It's more interest rates on mortgages are higher when you're a housing co-op or you're buying as a kind of community benefit society than they are for individuals. So that's something we have to think about. So interest rates on some of our projects that we're looking at the moment are starting at kind of 4.25% over different term periods. So for us that relationship with those social lenders is kind of massively important. So as I say, we involve them quite early. We also, for our schemes, often receive kind of grant funding, either for pre-development, and as a Brighton Hove Community Land Trust, we're also starting the process to become a registered provider, so we can hope to access some of the affordable housing grants. The level of kind of property and land costs in our city means that we need to be able to secure some of those. We need to be able to secure some of those grant funding. So how it works, we think that for each £1 of community shares investment that we get, we can leverage £5 through kind of other sources. And what our community share issue often looks to cover is kind of 20% of the overall value of the project at the moment. That's what we're looking. And if we're raising more community shares, what that means for us is that we have more flexible lending through the kind of long-term lending later, which means we can then transfer that to the next kind of project. So our aim is very much that kind of capital through projects leads on to being able to support other projects as well. So we can be flexible with that while also kind of keeping the investment as secure as we can for the investors.
Right, and I think that's a really interesting point that, for every £1 of community shares, you can then leverage other debt for these projects, and that is the beauty of platforms like ours, essentially, to help create that leverage and to be part of the overall financing mix for these projects. So we've got so what I'll do, I'm going to ask you a question about risks, and then I'm going to do a quick fire few questions to both of you for ones which have come in. And then we'll talk a little bit about, you know, plans for the future. So first of all, clearly everybody recognises that you're both so passionate about what you're doing, and you have so much knowledge about your sector and your area, which is incredibly valuable. But could you talk a little bit about the risks, and, you know, if land or property prices reduced in a recession, what would the effects of that be? What generally are the risks that are prominent for both of your businesses? Mike, if you go first.
Or shall I hand over to you, Ben? That's probably more directly up yours. Sorry to pass the buck, but
No,
up your street.
not at all, Mike. We put a I think pretty comprehensive risk section in the share offer, right, which is only correct, and I actually just pulled that up. So I mean, I think, you know, there are risks with any business, aren't there? And I don't know if people have completely grappled yet with COVID-19. There are regulatory risks as well for mustard seed property, or indeed any, I suppose, sort of provision of housing, affordable housing, supported housing, where you're relying on government effectively, who pay people's housing benefit or local housing allowance. So, I mean, if house prices fell, I mean, mustard seed property has sensible leases with strong charity partners. So it's unlikely that there's going to be any fall in the demand for the supported housing, or indeed the impact, or indeed the income that each property generates. So I think that puts mustard seed on a really secure foundation. However, if property prices, which can be quite depressed in Cornwall anyway, do decline, that would obviously affect your ability to raise debt. As Lisa just said, you know, the great thing about community shares, you'll be able to leverage that debt in and hopefully do more of what these great social enterprises do well. If property prices fall in areas perhaps where they're already depressed, that would impact the amount of debt you could raise and perhaps how quickly you could grow. Other risks, without wanting to go chapter and verse on that, I mean, you know, anybody, the same for kind of all businesses like this. You know, property development always carries some risk.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, and I was just going to say, in interest rates as well. Yeah, as Helen said, you know, already a bit higher. It seems sort of quite unfair in a way, doesn't it, that an individual can borrow at kind of half the rate at the moment that a community benefit society or a CLT can. But you know, no one knows what's going to happen with interest rates, but probably aren't going to go much higher for quite a while.
Yeah, Helen, what's your perspective?
Yes, I echo a lot of what Ben said there. I think someone raised a point which was good to see, because it's actually our kind of number one risk on our risk register, which is, you know, what happens. We're working with these community-led housing groups. That's who the link is coming from them. So we're kind of, you know, as the CLT, we're paying the mortgage back and we're paying the interest to our investors. So we have a kind of what we think and believe is a really robust structure, where we work with community groups for a long time, not just before we buy the property. And, you know, this network of kind of people, contractors, our voluntary directors who have experience in running community-led housing. So we kind of, we work going forward, and we have regular meetings, and we will continue to have regular meetings. We try before they arise. In our first project, which is working with Sea Salt, both organisations have funding ring fence. Sea Salt got a grant of £10,000 for the university, which is specifically ring fence for any kind of if any issues arise in them, like, you know, any unexpected costs, any problems kind of collecting the rent. So, you know, that's there we include high kind of void levels in the first, very kind of project planning, certainly for the first few years, which obviously like is pretty tricky for our cash flow at times, but we think it's really important to make sure that kind of, especially for those first years while a project is getting up and running, that that everything goes smoothly and we can cover those eventualities. We also, as part of our kind of work, so working with Ecology, which is who we've we're trying to work with on this mortgage on our first property, we stress test our assumptions. So we stress test kind of 3% rises in the mortgage interest rates over the first 3 years. So we have to subject our models to quite rigorous stress tests, and that's, as I say, hard at times because we've got higher interest rates. We're trying to work in a market that's not really set up for us, but I think is like critical for ensuring we know we'll be able to do what we say we do. We'll be able to uphold our terms to investors, and ultimately, we want our projects to run well and for the long term.
Great. And I think it's actually a really important point, perhaps, or to demonstrate that even though your organization is for community benefit, that doesn't mean that it hasn't been well governed. It doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't been through rigorous tests and stress test. The business model hasn't been stress tested. You are both working with social lenders, but they're still they still hold to high account, and they wouldn't lend to organizations that wouldn't cut the mustard. So yeah, just wanted to make that point. Now, there's a few interesting points about bonds versus shares, and people, saying that clearly there's a lot of people with money in cash ISAs who would like to seek a better return for their money. I suppose the point is that we always have to make is that investing your money is not without risk, and that clearly is a difference between saving your money, where you may get a very low interest rate but your money is secured, versus investing your money where you're putting your capital at risk and you could lose your money, and therefore you would hope to be compensated with some kind of higher interest rate to compensate for that risk. But social organizations obviously cannot necessarily pay an interest rate which is commensurate to perhaps the risk of the project, but you're achieving a very high social or environmental impact, and that could be I suppose calculated into a non-financial return to show that you're essentially getting a higher return, but it's a mix of financial and social / environmental. Hopefully that makes sense. And I think that the other point is that a lot of these organizations need long-term patient capital. And whilst you can have community bonds which are long-term, withdrawable shares does provide a much longer-term sustainable form of investment, which hopefully aligns the desires of the investors with the mission of the organisation, which I think is really important as well. So just on to a couple of quick fire questions. Bear with me 1 second. I wanted to ask a question to Mike, which was around what is the typical average stay for people within the housing? what's the typical lease length on the properties to your partners? And there was one other question, do you take a management fee? So 3 questions for you there, Mike.
Our aim is not to provide long-term accommodation, and it's to transition people through it back into as normal, into normal working situation in their own place of accommodation. So typically people come and they will be with us from a handful of months to say around about 2 years max. We have had one long-term tenant who actually is not with us now. He's moved on to, and he's been moved into another organisation, so successfully. So it's really, yes, it's short term. We are not providing. Otherwise, I think it would be quite different because this is our second property, 6 accommodation for 6 people, but it will help loads more than 6 people per year. That's how that one works. Sorry, next question on that was.
There was another question. Do you take a management fee? And what's the average lease to the?
Oh yes, to our partners. Yes. 5 years. It's obviously it will vary with different organisations, but it's usually about 5 years. And so that's right, isn't it, Ben? At the moment, with our lease with St Petrox. Yeah, well, Ben's nodding anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm
good.
Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you. And how do you encourage organisations to come to you to establish projects, or do you go out and find them?
Was that to me?
Yes, it was. Did you hear?
Okay. Yeah. So we run. One of our aims as an organisation is just to kind of get out there. Lots of people don't know what community-led housing, and lots of people don't know what community-led housing is, haven't heard of it. In our survey that we just did, though, 78% of people said they would be interested in building their own home. So we do a lot of outreach, to communities, in people to join. We have monthly meetups where we bring groups, individuals together to kind of help shape the strategy for action around the city. So as well as kind of the very practical work, groups, deliver projects, develop their we also kind of see ourselves as a movement for housing. We see ourselves as a movement to campaign for housing kind of across the city. And part of that work is, looking at groups who may be more excluded from the process of housing. So we kind of have an awareness of that and reach out to specific communities as well.
Great, thank you. And then there was another interesting question. Is there a way to encourage investments if the Treasury place community share offers under EIS in terms of tax relief? Well, super interesting question. In the industry, Resonance and Ethex and others are pushing for something called social investment tax relief to be expanded. Well, first of all, to be saved, but secondly, to be expanded to allow these types of organisations to benefit from that and to encourage investment and compensate the investors for the risk. You can write to your MP and tell them that this is a really important thing that they should be supporting. More news of that soon in the Treasury bill, which I think is being read shortly. Anyway, we have come to the end of our session, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. If you wanted to just say literally a couple of sentences about your hopes for the future and how you're, you hope to see things proceed, that would be lovely just to round out. Helen, why don't you go first?
We'd want to see community-led housing. We want to see community-led housing as something that is, you know, available and seen as a norm for more people. It is in other countries, it can be here. And I guess what we'd like around that is kind of some of the sort of structural and institutional support to make that happen. But that's what we want to do. We want to establish projects, keep establishing projects that work in the long term to provide housing that's just better and more beautiful, I think.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, our immediate aim is to complete the refurbishment of our property in Redruth and get that up and running, and you know, get it leased out, which is going to be no problem whatsoever, and get the, you know, to provide that income stream, and then to move on to a third property, and for the future go even on further, because there's just so much need out there. We have absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. It's really, people are crying out in Cornwall. It's a real mixture of the place, second homes from rich people and a lot of really deprived areas as well. Okay.
Thank you. Ben, anything you'd like to say to finish?
No, just thank you very much, Lisa. Thanks to everyone. I thought it was a really, really interesting session.
Great. And just to say, this is part one of our affordable housing sessions. We're planning to run another one as well, which will look at the different sort of financing mix and the financing that is available to organisations. So thanks very much for joining us, everybody. If you'd like to read anything else about the organisations that have been on the webinar today, you can go to our website. And we will follow up with an email. I hope you enjoyed our session, and see you all again soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.